Our final topic for this series is testing, at least an introduction to testing. So let's begin from scratch. We're going to use this concept of teams. So I'm going to build an application called Teams, and let's cd in there. And take a look at your test directory. Now, you'll be happy to hear, I think in the PHP world, Laravel's testing facilities are the peak of the mountain. They're really, really good. Okay, so if I open up my feature and unit directory, think of a feature as something your application should do, a feature of your site. So if you created a website to sell music back in 2001, then maybe a feature would be a user can sell music. Or another feature is you can buy music. Or a feature might be every band has a profile. Those are features. Now, unit tests are much more isolated and low level. So if a feature goes from the outside in, a unit test will be more like if I instantiate this class and then I call that method, then I expect some result. It's much more isolated on one or maybe a small grouping of classes. Now we can trigger our test suite by using this vendor bin PHP unit executable. Or you can add this to your path so that you can simply say PHP unit. Let's do that now. Let's create a little alias. Test equals vendor bin PHP unit. Okay, so now at least in this session, I can run test. And you'll see we get green. So we triggered two tests, a little example one here, and our feature test. Or I could say vendor bin PHP unit tests feature example test. And now I'm only testing this specific file. Okay, so I'm going to create a test here. Laravel includes an artisan command that basically scaffolds something just like this. So if we're going to create a feature for Teams, we'll call it Teams test. And if I switch back, here's what we get. Now, right out of the gate, I want you to notice this refresh database trait. So if I use it here, what this means is after every single test, if we have changed the state of the database in some way, refresh it, reset it, get rid of anything I did. So for example, let's imagine using Laravel's model factories. We talked about those a bit a number of episodes ago. So let's say we created a user. Well, think about it. If I did not use this trait, after every single test, I would have yet another user saved in my database. However, when I add refresh database, it will do a couple things depending upon your configuration. But typically, it will run all of this through what we call a database transaction. And once your test is done, it's just going to throw away the key. It's not going to commit the transaction, so everything in effect is undone. It's a nice way to ensure that every test begins in the exact same database state. All right, so as a general rule of thumb, if you ever write tests that will insert or delete or change the database in some form, add this trait to your tests. Okay, so let's just begin our first feature. A user can create a team. Okay, a user can create a team. Now, you'll notice this little test annotation here. So you have two ways to tell PHP unit that a particular method is a test. One way is to add this little @test annotation at the top. Another way is to begin the method with test. Both work. Typically, I like to use the annotation only because it makes my method name a little more readable. And when I'm writing a test, I want this to read as close to a sentence as possible. So that's why I'm using snake casing here rather than camel casing. I want it to read like a sentence. A user can create a team. Okay. Next, at least in the early stage, I do recommend just write it out the way you would speak it. And we often use this given, when, then convention. For example, given I am a user who is logged in. All right, so immediately we can see, well, we probably need to create a user and we need to set them as the authenticated user for the application. We need to sign them in. All right, next. Well, when they hit the endpoint, and maybe it will be Teams. So example.com/teams. When they hit the endpoint to create a new team while passing the necessary data, well then there should be a new team in the database. Very simple. Okay, so now that you've written it out, you've gathered your thoughts, you'll now go line by line and convert this to code. All right, given I am a user who is logged in. So again, I can use model factories or database factories here. App user create. But next I have to set them as logged in. Now, we're not going to do anything where we say, go to the login page and fill out the email and fill out the password and then click this button. We're not going to do that. Instead, Laravel has a method called acting as. So acting as this user that we just created. So this will return a user instance, and we're just passing that to this method acting as. So now we have a new user in our database, and that user is currently signed in. Great. Next, when they hit the endpoint, so this would be them clicking a button, taking some action, filling out a form that will hit this endpoint. So you'll notice this is just a matter of preference. You have two ways. One way would be to write the code to visit a page, fill out a form, and submit it. Another way is assume that form works and then begin at the endpoint. And I find this ends up being, you don't have the form under test. You could write other tests for that, but it's also not nearly as brittle. Again, it's up to you, but maybe start with this. So Laravel has little helpers here to submit post or patch or get requests. If we're creating a new team, this will be a basic post request. Now, I can pass through the necessary data, and again, this will be the equivalent of what the user filled out in the form. Well, it sounds like we would need to know who is the owner of the team, but in addition to that, maybe every team has a name. So let's set that to Acme. Okay. Now, this is an option, but if you think about it, in my controller, when I create a team, I'm going to set the owner of the team to the person who is currently signed in, this person. So that means this kind of redundant. We don't need to provide it. So it sounds like this is all we need. Okay, great. Finally, our verification step. There should be a new team in the database. Okay. Laravel includes a helper method called assert database has. We give it two arguments, the name of the table to search in, teams. Now, again, you'll notice none of this exists. There is no endpoint for teams. There is no database table called teams. We are writing the test before the code has been written, and this is called basic test-driven development. Okay, so I'm going to look for a record in the teams table where the name column is equal to Acme. So let's give this a test. Now, once again, I can run it manually. So we have teams test, and of course it's going to fail. Or just about every modern code editor will have some kind of plugin or functionality to quickly run your tests. So for example, in Sublime, I use a plugin that will instantly test the method under the cursor, like that. Just do a little bit of Googling and you should be able to streamline this. Until then, I'm going to do it manually. All right, so it failed. Access denied for user homestead at localhost. Of course, this is a brand new application. We haven't yet set up our database details. Okay, I'm going to go to .env. I'm going to use a MySQL database. The name of the database will be teams, which I need to create. The username by default on my system is root, and the password is blank. Okay, let's go to SQL Pro, and I'm going to add a database called teams. There we go. Now, let's run our test again. Okay, good. Our error has changed, and this is what you want when you're writing test-driven development. You write a test that fails, and then you begin working toward making that pass. So often, you'll write a little bit of code, you run the test again, and if the error changes, that means usually you've made progress. So in this case, it's saying, hey, there's no teams table. I don't know what you want here. All right, that's our next step. Make me a new migration for a teams table. Okay, let's open that file, create teams table. And to begin, we've specified that a team belongs to a user. So a user can own and manage a team. All right, unsigned integer, user ID. Next, a table consists of a name. Now we can also set up the foreign key constraint here, but I'm going to skip that. Okay, so now that we have our migration here, let's run it again. And the error has changed. Now again, do note that because we're using this refresh database trait, it automatically ran our migration. So if I switch over to SQL Pro and give it a refresh, you'll see that we do have that teams table. Now, if we have time, later in the video, I'll show you how to set up a separate testing database or even a testing database in memory. But for now, we're going to use our same local database and then just roll everything back after we're done. Anyways, let's switch back. Failed asserting that a row in the table matches the attributes, so the error has changed. We looked in the teams table, but we didn't see anything with the name of Acme. Okay, of course not. Again, we have this endpoint here, but we don't do anything. We haven't even responded to it. So that's our next step. Go to our route/web file, and we could set up a controller, but I'm just going to do it here. Listen for a post request to Teams. And now we need to grab what will ultimately be the form data that the user filled out. But we are simulating that and passing that through here. So if I want to grab name is Acme, just like from a form, I can say request name. Okay, so let's begin by validating the request. And we'll say that name column does need to be required. Next, I don't have a team model set up just yet. So why don't we do that? PHP Artisan, make me a model called team. All right. Now I can say app team create, and we'll pass through the attributes like we reviewed. Now we can either return a response or a redirect, whatever would be appropriate for the app. Okay, so let's run our test again. And it still fails, and I bet this could be a little confusing because from your end, well, we did everything we think correctly. I happen to know what the issue is, but you might personally be thinking, well, why isn't it working? And we don't see any error. There must be some kind of exception thrown. So here's the deal. By default, these tests will handle any exceptions that come into play, and it catches them and handles them gracefully. But often for your test, that isn't what you want. So what you can do, either for your entire test suite or a single method or a single class, is you can call without exception handling. So we don't want Laravel to catch any exceptions and handle them, because that's not quite what we want. We actually want to see the exception on the fly. Make sense? So we call without exception handling. Now, watch if I run this again. Okay, now we can see a bit better. Okay, a mass assignment exception was thrown. Of course, that's because for team, we did not set up guarded or fillable fields. Okay, now let's run it again. And we've changed the error. All right, so field user ID does not have a default value. Okay, so we would expect this, right? If I come back to this section, we created a team, but a team needs to belong to a user, and we didn't specify who that user was. So why don't we start by saying attributes, user ID, or owner ID if you prefer, will be the authenticated user's ID. Now, we can do this in a slightly different way, but let's start with this. But before I run it, I do want you to think about something. This endpoint can be hit by anyone, but we can see that it's required that you're authenticated. So we do need the necessary middleware, and we'll do that in a minute. Let's come back and run it again. There we go. And now we get green. So congratulations. We definitely took the long route for that. You can do it much more quickly once you get into a nice workflow. But nonetheless, you've just used TDD to prepare your first feature test. And by the way, once you're at green, if you wish, you can remove this entirely. That can be something you temporarily add as you're working on a test. Now, finally, a little bit of cleanup. Why don't we set up the attributes here? And then I can update this. Okay, so we've made some changes. Let's rerun our test, and we're still at green. Now think about what the benefit is here. For the lifetime of your site, when it comes to how we create a new team, you have complete assurance that it works. And if you ever make some kind of change here, like you accidentally remove a line, well, when you run the test, it's instantly going to tell you, don't deploy because something changed here and your tests are no longer working. But to wrap up, we do want to handle the situation where you hit this endpoint and you're not signed in. It sounds like we need a test that says, guests may not create teams. So let's say, I'll paste this in one more time. Let's disable exception handling. And then I'm not going to sign a user in. I'm just going to hit that endpoint. And let's see what happens. So if we run it, all right, it fails. We get a validation exception. And that's because, yes, we did hit this endpoint and we proceeded to validate the request. So it sounds like we need to add the auth middleware that we reviewed. So assuming you're signed in, then we'll respond to this post request. Okay, so now if I run it again, let's see. Route login not defined. So the issue here, let's go to the middleware for authenticate. This is the code that's being executed there. On the condition that you are not authenticated, At the moment, it tries to redirect you to the login route, but we don't even have one. If we want, we could quickly set one up, or I could even say PHP artisan make auth. Okay, anyways, let's give that another run. Scroll back up. Okay, and now we get an authentication exception. And this is what we want. We're trying to access this endpoint, but we're accessing it as a guest. So of course, it's throwing an authentication exception. That's what we would want. So at this point, we could turn this off entirely and say, okay, I assert that we are redirected to the login page. Now let's come back, run it again, and we do get green. So this can be a useful test to have. You can even do it right up here. You start by saying a guest may not create a team. So we're going to prove that because we don't want any scenario where a random user, a random guest user, can hit an endpoint that creates new records in our database. So we'll confirm that. If you make a post request here without signing in, we will redirect you. So now at this point, because all of the tests are passing, you can move on to a refactor phase. For example, maybe we want a relationship between a user and their teams. Okay, well now at this point, we can drop down a level. So let's write a unit test or a model test, or some call it an integration test. It doesn't really matter. We're going to create one here. And if I say help make test, you'll see that we can specify this unit flag. And that just means, all right, we want a unit test, not a feature test. So PHP artisan make me a test for our users. So users test, but this will be on the unit level. So let's say a user can have a team. Okay, so notice in this case, we're at a bit of a lower level. Up here, we were actually hitting endpoints and URLs. Here, we're going to work with the team class directly. It's at a much lower level. So let's say, given I have a user. Well, next, let's say user teams create, where the name is Acme once again. And at this point, I should be able to say assert equals Acme if I say get me the user's team and then grab the name of that team. Okay, so let's give this a run. And let's see, undefined method user teams. Okay, that's our first step. So right up here in my user class, team. And actually, I called that teams. It should probably be team. Okay, let's run it one more time. Okay, so now we have that method, but we can't call create on it. And that's because we haven't returned an eloquent relationship. All right, what is the relationship between a user and their team? Well, a user, in our example, they have exactly one team. Okay, so if I come back and run it, we do get green. So now this is working. But do note, once again, we are creating records in our database here. So let's make sure we use the refresh database trait to roll everything back when we're done. Because again, if I were to switch over to SQL Pro, you could see all of these test records, and we don't want those. None of these need to be here. Okay, so we run it again, and we still get green. So now we drop down a level to prove that a user has a team. And do remember, when we call create in this way, the user ID will automatically be assigned by Eloquent, which means we can now move up a level again. So this is what you'll often do. You'll start on the outside, you'll write a test, and at a certain point, even if the test is still failing, you'll think, okay, I need to drop down a level. So I'm going to write a brand new test at this lower level to make sure that this small bit of code works. And then once you get green, you jump back up the level to your outside in test, and then you rerun it. So in this case, I'm back to our teams test. So if we run that one, here's the teams test. That's still passing, but I'm now going to do a little refactoring. When we handle the creation of a team, I'm now going to say, get me the authenticated user, team, create, and then I'll pass through the attributes. And I can remove this section where we explicitly set the user ID, because we've learned that will happen automatically now. So if I run the tests again, I don't even have to open a browser. I know it works because the test returns green. So finally, if you want to get crazy, you could just move all of this inline here. And I don't know, did we make a mistake? Let's run it. Nope, it's still returning green. Okay, so you know what? I think that's going to do it. Finally, for extra credit, only if you want some extra credit, if you want to use a separate database for your testing, let me show you how to do that. And then we're going to call this a series. So you have two options. If you create a .env.testing file, Well, when you run PHP unit, it's going to read from this file, and only on that condition. So what you could do is move all of this over here and then override anything that's necessary. So maybe you have a database called Teams Testing. Okay, well now, when you run your PHP unit tests, it will use this database. Let me show you. If we run it, I think this is going to fail. Yeah. So if we scroll up, it's trying to say, okay, well, you told me to use this database, but it doesn't exist. And of course not, we haven't created it. So that would be one way to do this. You create your database, run it again, it's going to migrate for you. And now you have two separate instances. You have your local database, and then you have your testing database. Okay. Now another option, if you don't want to go this route, let's delete that, is you can also specify environment variables in your phpunit.xml file. Think of this as a configuration file for most of your settings. But if I scroll down, you can also specify environment variables, and these will correspond to what you have here. So that means, like right here, let's say you want to use not an actual MySQL database, but an SQLite database in memory. Okay, well, let's override DB connection. So let's come back right here, and we'll say DB connection will be SQLite. And then finally, let me show you this. We'll go to our config/database file. If I scroll down, here is the connection for SQLite. Well, we could use a file-based database, but again, if I want to use it in memory, there's actually a little keyword, and this is just something you would learn if you researched SQLite. But you could do this. DB database will be memory. This is our way of saying, okay, I want a database, but don't create a file for it. We're just going to do this all in memory. Okay, so now, if I switch back to SQL Pro, I can delete this database entirely. And if I run my tests, I think I'll still get green, and I do. But now, we're not using our local database anymore. Instead, we're running our migrations on the fly, and we're doing it all in memory.